You're a nobody, Matthew. My daughter deserves better. My name is Matthew Hayes and I'm 37 years old. I've spent the last 12 years building a private equity firm in Boston, making the kind of investments most people never see coming. I operate through shell companies, anonymous funds, and holding corporations that keep my name buried so deep in paperwork that it takes the sharpest lawyers months to find me. That's how I like it, clean, invisible, powerful. But in that moment, standing in my father-in-law's kitchen, watching him swirl his coffee cup like he was conducting an orchestra of insults, I felt anything but powerful. You are about to hear a story of love and revenge. Please subscribe to the channel and comment with what part of the world you're watching from. It really helps our work. The kitchen had that distinct smell of the premium coffee Robert insisted on importing, mixed with the sweet aroma of fresh toast. The morning light poured through the large windows, illuminating the flawless marble of the center island, where he leaned like a judge about to deliver a sentence. I could feel a cold sweat starting to form on my back, not from fear, but from a controlled rage that had been building for years. Robert Sterling has been calling me useless for 3 years. At every family dinner, every holiday, every time I walked through his front door. She could have married Dr. Thompson's son, he continued, gesturing toward my wife, Laura. But no, she chose you, a man who won't even tell us what he really does for a living. I watched the veins pop in his neck as he spoke, his face turning that reddish shade that always preceded his most venomous attacks. Robert had an irritating habit of chewing gum during these tirades. The sound of his jaw clicking punctuated each insult like a drumbeat marking the rhythm of my humiliation. Laura was sitting at the breakfast table, pushing eggs around on her plate. She never looked up, never said a word, just kept stirring those damn eggs as if they held the answer to everything wrong in our marriage. Her fork scraped against the porcelain in a constant circular, hypnotic pattern. I had counted 27 circular motions since Robert began his latest speech. Matthew works in finance. Dad, she finally mumbled, still not looking at me. Her voice had that thin, almost brittle quality I had learned to recognize. It was the voice she used when she wanted a conversation to end without having to actually confront anyone. It was the voice of surrender. Finance? Robert scoffed, spitting a piece of gum into the trash with practiced precision. You know what that means? Nothing. He could be selling insurance for all we know. He could be managing retirement funds out of some strip mall office. I watched him pace around his granite kitchen island, his face getting redder with each lap. His custom-made Italian shoes clicked against the imported hardwood floor. Every step was a declaration of superiority, every movement calculated to remind me I was on his territory, breathing his air, married to his daughter. This was Robert Sterling, founder and CEO of BioNexus, a struggling biotech firm that hadn't turned a real profit in 4 years. He inherited money from his father's construction empire and thought that made him some kind of financial genius. But inherited money smells different from earned money. It smells of unearned arrogance, of confidence built on foundations others dug. What Robert didn't know was that I had been tracking his company's financial reports for 8 months. I knew every line of the balance sheet, every footnote in the financing documents, every whispered conversation among potential investors who had decided BioNexus was too big a risk. BioNexus was bleeding cash, burning through what little venture funding it had left. They needed a miracle. They needed exactly the kind of anonymous investor I specialized in being. You just sit there like a mute, Robert said, jabbing a finger toward my chest. His finger trembled slightly, a tiny sign that even his own confidence had cracks. Real men speak up. Real men defend themselves. I wanted to ask if real men also laid off loyal employees to cover up their own disastrous business decisions. I wanted to ask if real men humiliated their sons-in-law to distract from their own failings. But I had learned that with people like Robert, words were wasted. What they understood was consequence. I nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle around me like a thick fog. You're right, Mr. Sterling. The kitchen went silent, the kind of silence that feels like it sucks the oxygen out of the air. Even the state-of-the-art refrigerator seemed to stop humming. Laura finally looked up from her plate, confusion written all over her face. Her eyes, those same brown eyes that made me fall in love 5 years ago, now held something different. Fear maybe, or guilt, probably both. Even Robert seemed taken aback by my response. His mouth hung open slightly, his jaw slack as if he were recalibrating his attack strategy. "I am right," he said, his voice now uncertain, searching for the trap he was sure I had laid. "Absolutely," I said, standing up and grabbing my coat from the back of the chair. The fabric was warm against my fingers, heated by the morning sun that continued. Indifferent to the drama unfolding in this kitchen, straight out of a magazine. "Laura deserves better." The words came out calm, measured, each syllable spoken with the clarity of someone who has finally understood a fundamental truth. There was no anger in my voice, no sarcasm, just a simple, devastating acknowledgement that something had been permanently broken. I walked toward the front door, feeling their eyes on my back. My footsteps echoed in the wide hall decorated with family photographs that never truly included me. As I reached the doorknob, I heard Laura's chair scrape against the floor with a sharp screech that seemed to scream the urgency her voice couldn't convey. "Matthew." Wait, but I was already outside, breathing in the cool July morning air, knowing that everything was about to change. The air had that distinct Boston morning smell, a mix of sea salt, bread baking from the corner bakery, and the fresh ozone that precedes rain. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the promise of freedom. I met Laura 5 years ago at a conference just outside the city. The conference hall was packed, the air conditioning struggling against the heat generated by 200 professionals crammed in to hear the latest in gene therapy. I was in the 5th row, reviewing investment documents on my tablet, half listening to the presentations. Then Laura took the stage. She was presenting research on gene therapy applications, brilliant and passionate about her work at a small biotech startup. Her hands moved as she spoke, sketching imaginary molecules in the air, her eyes shining with that intensity that only comes from someone who truly loves what they do. I found myself leaning forward, completely forgetting the documents in my lap. I was there because I was considering an investment in the medical tech sector. I didn't expect to fall in love with the presenter. After her talk, I approached her at the coffee station. My opening line was terrible, something about how her findings could revolutionize the treatment of genetic diseases. She laughed, not the polite way people do at conferences, but a genuine laugh that lit up her entire face. She said it was the first time anyone at a conference had approached her with a comment about her research instead of her last name. That should have been my first warning about Robert. Our relationship moved fast. Too fast, probably. There was an urgency between us, as if we were both running from something. For me, it was the loneliness of building a financial empire with no one to share it with. For Laura, I would find out much later. It was the suffocating pressure of being Robert Sterling's daughter, always measured against impossible expectations. Within 18 months, we were married in a small ceremony that her father complained about for weeks. The ceremony took place in a modest garden in the Berkshires. Just 40 guests, acoustic music, and vows we wrote ourselves. Laura wore a simple dress she picked out herself, without her mother's or sister's input. She was radiant, laughing as she stumbled slightly over her vows, her hands trembling in mine. He wanted something bigger, more expensive, something that would impress his country club friends. Robert spent the entire reception complaining to anyone who would listen about the event's lack of ambition. He compared our wedding to that of a partner's daughter, a 3-day extravaganza at a luxury resort that cost more than most people make in 5 years. But Laura and I preferred simple things. Or so I thought. During the reception, I watched her tense up every time her father approached, her smile becoming fixed and forced. She would grip my hand tighter, as if anchoring herself against a storm only she could feel coming. The trouble started during our first Christmas as a married couple. Robert had too much wine and began interrogating me about my job. The dinner table was decorated with an excess of holiday ornaments, expensive candles that smelled of cinnamon and pine, and china that probably cost more than my first car. I gave him the same vague answers I gave everyone. Private investments, portfolio management, consulting for high net worth individuals. His eyes narrowed with each answer, like an interrogator who knows he's being lied to but can't prove it. The wine had stained his lips purple, and he punctuated each question by tapping his finger on the tabletop, making the silverware rattle. It was all technically true, but it was missing the crucial detail that I was the high net worth individual. My firm, Ventura Capital, managed over $1 billion in assets. We specialized in early-stage investments in tech and medical companies, the kind of business that demanded discretion and anonymity. The world I operated in was built on layers of confidentiality, where revealing too early who was behind an investment could ruin deals that took years to structure. I built my reputation by staying invisible, letting other people take the credit while I quietly reaped returns most investors could only dream of. There was a beauty in that invisibility, a power in being underestimated. The best deals I ever closed happened because the other party never saw me coming. But Robert interpreted my discretion as weakness. He started making comments about my mystery job and how a real man would be more transparent about his career. The comments would come casually, dropped into the middle of conversations about other things, like little time bombs set to detonate my confidence. Laura would change the subject or laugh nervously, that forced laugh that had none of the genuine joy I'd fallen in love with, but she never told him to stop. Never defended me. And every time she stayed silent, every time she looked away while her father dissected me, a small piece of my respect for her died. Not dramatically, not with a burst of anger, just a slow, steady erosion, like water dripping on stone. The verbal attacks intensified over the following months. Robert made snide remarks about my clothes, saying I dressed like a back-office clerk instead of someone with real aspirations. My car, a hybrid sedan I'd chosen for its efficiency, was a punchline for jokes about middle-aged men who'd given up on impressing anyone. My lack of ambition was a recurring theme, as if working quietly and living modestly was evidence of some moral failing. He compared me to other men in their social circle, successful doctors and lawyers who drove expensive cars and talked loudly about their achievements. There's a certain type of man who confuses noise with substance, who believes worth is measured in designer logos and bar talk business deals. Robert was the epitome of that type. What made it all worse was watching Laura shrink during these confrontations. The confident scientist I married, the woman who commanded conference rooms with her expertise, became quiet and apologetic in her father's presence. It was like watching someone transform into a smaller version of herself, constantly making excuses for her father's behavior, rationalizing the irrational. She would pull me aside after particularly brutal dinners and whisper apologies, her cold hands gripping mine. She'd promised things would get better, that her dad was just under a lot of stress with the company, that he didn't mean it. But she never confronted him directly, never drew that line in the sand and said enough. And I started to realize that maybe she never would. That maybe deep down a part of her agreed with him. Not fully, not consciously, but enough to be paralyzed between the two of us, unable to choose. 3 months ago, I discovered something that changed everything. While researching potential investments in biotech, a trend I'd been tracking since I met Laura, I came across the financing documents for BioNexus, filed in a public securities offering database. The company was in serious trouble, burning through cash faster than they could raise it. The numbers told a brutal story. Revenue down 30% year over year, operational costs soaring. A debt-to-revenue ratio that would make any financial analyst recoil in horror. They had approached dozens of venture capital firms, but their debt-to-revenue ratio scared off most serious investors. There were notes in the margins from previous investor documents, coded comments that essentially said the same thing. Problematic management, weak fundamentals, too high a risk. That's when I realized I had a choice. I could help save Robert's company through an anonymous investment, or I could let it fail. From a purely business standpoint, the core technology at BioNexus was sound. The research team had respectable publications. The intellectual assets were worth the investment. The businessman in me saw the potential for profit, an undervalued company with promising tech that could generate significant returns under the right management. The son-in-law in me saw something else entirely, an opportunity to finally show Robert Sterling who really held the power. I began the due diligence process, keeping my identity buried under layers of corporate structure. I used 3 different subsidiaries, each registered in separate jurisdictions, each with its own paper trail and legal representation. Robert would never know that his salvation was sitting at his own dinner table, listening to his insults, watching his daughter stay silent while he systematically destroyed her husband. There was a delicious irony to it. While Robert was calling me a failure, I was reviewing the financial documents that proved he was incompetent. While he was mocking my lack of ambition, I was structuring an investment that would save everything he'd worked for, while he was treating me like dirt. I was holding his future in my hands, and at every dinner, with every insult, I asked myself whether I should squeeze or let go. The breaking point came 3 weeks ago during Laura's birthday dinner. Robert's house was too crowded, too hot, too loud with the kind of forced conversation that happens when people who don't particularly like each other pretend to be a happy family. We were at Robert's, and he'd invited his brother-in-law Howard, a heart surgeon who loved to talk about his vacation home in the Berkshires and his new private practice, catering to executives willing to pay a premium for discretion. Howard just bought a new boat, Robert announced as Laura cut the cake, his voice slicing through every other conversation in the room. He had a way of making announcements, as if his every word deserved the full attention of everyone present. A 40-foot yacht cost more than most people make in 5 years. Howard laughed and slapped me on the shoulder with unnecessary force, the kind of touch that establishes dominance disguised as camaraderie. His breath smelled of expensive whiskey and cheap arrogance. "And you, Matthew? Any big purchases recently? New car, investment property?" I should have seen what was coming. I should have seen Robert positioning himself for the attack. That glint in his eye that meant he'd found a perfect opening. Robert's eyes gleamed with that familiar glint that meant he was about to deliver the final blow. He leaned back in his chair, savoring the moment like a predator who knew his prey had nowhere to run. "Matthew doesn't make those kinds of purchases," Robert said, his voice dripping with a fake sympathy, as artificial as the sweeteners he used in his coffee. "He's a more practical man, aren't you, Matthew?" Laura squeezed my hand under the table, a silent warning for me to keep calm, to not turn her birthday into another battlefield. Her nails dug slightly into my skin, a desperate anchor trying to keep me tethered to civilized behavior. But Robert wasn't finished. He was never finished until he had wrung every last drop of humiliation he could from a moment. "I mean, let's be honest here," he continued, his voice getting louder, ensuring everyone in the room could hear every word. "My daughter is a brilliant scientist. She's published in major journals. She lectures at international conferences. She could have married anyone, a doctor, a lawyer, someone with real prospects. Instead, she settled for..." He gestured vaguely in my direction, as if I were a smudge on his line of sight. "Well, we all make mistakes." The room fell silent, the kind of awkward silence that happens when people witness cruelty and don't know whether to intervene or pretend they saw nothing. Someone coughed nervously. A glass clinked against a table. Laura's hand went slack in mine, and somehow that hurt more than anything Robert had said. Howard was staring at the cake as if it were the most fascinating thing he had ever seen, studying the frosting roses like they were surgical specimens. Laura's sister was typing furiously on her phone, pretending to be too busy to have heard. Her mother just stared into her lap, as she always did when Robert became unbearable. And Robert sat there with a satisfied smirk, crossing his arms over his chest, waiting for my reaction like a boxer waiting for his opponent to get up for another round. I looked at Laura, really looked at her, as if I were seeing her for the first time in months. She was staring into her lap, her face flushed with shame, but not shame for her father's behavior, not anger that he had ruined her celebration, not outrage that he had humiliated her husband in front of her entire family. No, it was shame for me, for being married to someone her father deemed inferior. And in that moment, I saw the entire truth of our marriage unfold like a map I'd been reading upside down. That's when I understood this was never going to get better. Laura was never going to defend me because deep down, she agreed with him. Maybe not completely, maybe not consciously, but enough to stay silent, enough to let him tear me down in front of her family, enough for every insult to be validated by her inaction. The decision I'd been putting off for months crystallized in that moment. It was clear and cold and absolutely right. I stood up slowly, placed my napkin carefully on the table, smoothing out the creases with fingers that did not tremble. I looked directly at Robert, holding his gaze until his smirk began to falter. "You are absolutely right," I said, my voice calm and measured and completely devoid of emotion. "She deserves better." I kissed Laura on the forehead, feeling her flinch under my lips. Her skin was cold and I could feel her pulse racing at her temple. I took my coat from the back of the chair and walked out of the dining room, down the hallway where family photographs looked down at me with smiling faces that never truly included my own. Behind me, I heard Laura call my name, a thin, frightened sound that might have stopped me 6 months ago. But not then. In that moment, all I heard was the echo of 3 years of silences. 3 years of her choosing peace over me, choosing her father's approval over her husband's dignity. I had work to do. The drive home gave me time to think. The streets of Boston blurred past the window in a wash of lights and shadows, and for the first time in months, my mind was perfectly clear. There was no doubt, no hesitation, just a cold, hard certainty about what needed to happen next. For months, I'd been preparing the investment documents for BioNexus, a $75 million funding package that would save Robert's company and secure his comfortable retirement. The paperwork was pristine, reviewed by 3 different law firms, structured to give BioNexus not just a financial lifeline, but a foundation for real growth. It just needed my signature. I pulled into my garage, cut the engine, and sat in the car for 10 minutes, staring at the blank walls, listening to the engine cool with metallic clicks and pops. My decision was made, but I ran through it mentally one last time, looking for flaws in my logic, searching for any sign I was acting on emotion instead of reason. I found none. I wasn't going to sign those documents. In fact, I was going to do something far more satisfying. I was going to let Robert Sterling learn exactly what it felt like to need someone he considered a nobody. And when he finally understood who I really was, when he realized his financial salvation had been sitting at his dinner table all along, it would be too late for anything but regret. The perfect revenge isn't explosive, it's surgical, and I was about to perform the most precise operation of my career. The next morning, I called my lawyer, James Price, before 7 a.m. James was a veteran of the financial markets, a man who had seen fortunes made and destroyed with the stroke of a pen. He picked up before the second ring, his voice still hoarse with sleep but already alert. "Matthew, everything all right?" "This is early even for you. I need you to draft 3 documents for me, James. Today." I heard the creak of a chair, the sound of a pen being picked up. "I'm listening." I had him draft a formal withdrawal of investment interest in BioNexus, a contract termination notice for the pending funding agreement, and a release of confidentiality that would allow me to disclose my identity as the anonymous investor. Every word I spoke was precise, deliberate. There was no room for ambiguity or reinterpretation. On the other end of the line, James was silent for a long moment. I could hear his breathing, the ticking of a clock in the background, and I knew he was processing not just the legal implications, but what this meant personally. "Are you sure about this, Matthew?" His voice had that careful quality of someone trying not to influence a decision, but needing to confirm the person on the other end truly understood what they were doing. "You spent months on due diligence. The investment fundamentals are solid, family politics notwithstanding. BioNexus has real tech, real assets. You're leaving at least 20 million in potential returns on the table." "I'm sure," I said, and there was a finality in my voice that made James stop arguing. Sometimes the best investment is the one you don't make. Sometimes leaving money on the table costs less than the price of your dignity. James sighed, a long, resigned sound. "You're the client. I'll have the documents ready by noon. Want to review them before delivery?" "No need, I trust your work. Just make sure the notification is delivered to BioNexus at 10 a.m. tomorrow. Precise timing, James. Not a minute sooner, not a minute later." "Understood. And Matthew," he hesitated, choosing his words carefully, "I hope you know what you're doing. I know exactly what I'm doing." By noon, I had everything I needed. James would deliver the withdrawal notice to BioNexus at exactly 10 the next morning. I wanted Robert to have a full day to panic before he understood what had happened. I wanted him to feel the ground crumble beneath his feet, to experience that sense of total powerlessness, of being at the mercy of forces he couldn't control. I spent the afternoon in my office, looking out over the city from the 20th floor windows. Boston spread out before me, a concrete jungle of ambition where fortunes changed hands every day. Down below, millions of people were fighting to survive, to thrive, to make their mark. And up here, I was about to fundamentally alter the course of one man's life with nothing more than my absent signature on a document. There was power in that, a power that made my old need for Robert's approval seem pathetic by comparison. That evening, Laura came home around 8. She'd been at her sister's since the birthday dinner, likely being consoled, likely listening to her whole family rationalize Robert's behavior, as they always did. She walked in the door with red-rimmed eyes, her hair in a messy ponytail, wearing the same clothes from 2 days ago. From her posture, hands twisting the strap of her purse, shoulders hunched as if bracing for a blow, I could tell she had been crying. But I was past the point where her tears moved me. "We need to talk," she said, sitting in the armchair across from me in our living room. She chose the chair instead of the sofa where we used to sit together. Even in the geography of the conversation, there was distance. "Okay, my dad called me today." She looked down at her hands, unable to meet my eyes. "He's worried he went too far the other night." I almost laughed. Worried? After 3 years of non-stop insults, Robert was worried? No, he wasn't worried. He was calculating, realizing he might have finally crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "He wants to apologize," Laura continued, her voice gaining a bit of urgency, as if the word apologize could fix years of damage. "Maybe we could have dinner this weekend, just the 3 of us. Start over. He's really sorry, Matthew. He gets like that sometimes. It's the stress from work, the pressure of the company." I studied her face, searching for any sign that she understood what had really happened, searching for some spark of anger at her father's behavior, some recognition that years of verbal abuse couldn't be erased with an awkward dinner and a forced apology. But Laura still thought this was about hurt feelings and bruised pride. She had no idea her father had just insulted the only person who could save his company. She didn't know the time bomb was already counting down. "Laura," I said carefully, choosing each word as if navigating a minefield, "how long have you been ashamed of me?" The question blindsided her. Her face went pale, her mouth opening and closing without a sound. "What? I'm not ashamed." "Matthew, how could you think that? You have never once told your father to stop insulting me." A small patch of red appeared on each of her cheeks, but I continued. "Not once in 3 years. Not when he called me mediocre last Christmas. Not when he suggested you'd wasted your life with me at Easter. Not when he compared me to trash in front of your entire family on your birthday." "He doesn't mean it," she whispered, but there was a fragility in her voice that suggested even she didn't believe it anymore. "He's just protective. He wants what's best for me." "He called me useless trash in front of your entire family," I repeated, each word dropping between us like stones in still water. "You said nothing. You sat there staring at your plate, and you said absolutely nothing." Laura's eyes filled with tears that began to spill down her cheeks. She didn't try to wipe them away. I didn't know what to say. He gets so angry when people confront him. "Didn't you see how he got when Mom tried to defend my sister's husband at that Christmas dinner? He didn't speak to her for a week, so you chose his comfort over my dignity." "That's not fair," she protested, but her voice was weak, defeated. "You don't understand what it's like growing up with him, what it's like trying to keep the peace. He's my father, Matthew. I can't just cut him off, I can't just..." But it was fair, and we both knew it. Laura had made her choice a long time ago. Every time she stayed silent, every time she made excuses for his behavior, every time she asked me to be understanding, to not make waves, to let it go just one more time, she was choosing her father over her husband. And I had been foolish enough to accept it, thinking eventually she would find the courage to draw a line. "I love you," she said, and the words broke in the middle, shattered by emotion. That somehow made it worse because I knew it was true. She did love me, just not enough. "I know you do," I replied softly, and for the first time since the conversation began, I felt something break inside me too. But love isn't enough when you don't fight for it. Love without action is just a feeling, Laura, and feelings don't build marriages. Choices do. She sat there crying silently, and I forced myself not to go to her, not to comfort her as I had hundreds of times before, because this time was different. This time there was no going back. "What do you want me to do?" she finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Tell me what to do and I'll do it. I'll talk to him." I'll make him understand he can't treat you like this anymore. But it was too late for that. The documents were drafted. The plan was in motion. And even if I could stop it all with a single phone call, I knew I wouldn't. Because this was never just about Robert learning a lesson. It was about me finally understanding my own worth. I don't want you to do anything, Laura. I want you to understand that choices have consequences. And after 3 years of choosing your father's comfort over your husband's dignity, the consequences have finally arrived. She left an hour later, taking only a small bag with a few clothes. She said she was going to stay with her sister for a few days to give us both time to think. But we both knew she wouldn't be back. Not really. Even if we stayed married, even if we went to therapy and worked through our surface-level problems, there would always be a part of her that saw me through her father's eyes. There would always be that seed of doubt, that whispering voice that maybe Robert was right, that maybe she really had settled for less than she deserved. I watched from the window as she put the bag in her car, her movements slow and heavy. She looked up once, our eyes meeting through the glass, and I saw in her everything that could have been and never would be. Then she got in the car and drove away, her taillights disappearing into the Boston night. The next morning I woke up early and went to my office. The city was just beginning to stir, the traffic still light, the sky tinged with shades of pink and orange that would soon be swallowed by the urban haze. There was a clarity to that time of morning, a sense of possibility before the day became cluttered with decisions and consequences. At exactly 10 a.m., I called James to confirm the withdrawal notice had been delivered to BioNexus. His secretary signed for the document at 10:02, he said, and I could hear the creak of his chair as he leaned back. Delivered directly to Robert Sterling's office. I imagine he's reading it right about now. Thank you, James. Matthew, he hesitated, and I could feel the weight of unsaid words pressing through the phone line. Whatever your reason for doing this, I hope it's worth it. It will be. 20 minutes later, my phone rang. Laura's name flashed on the screen, and for a moment I considered not answering. But curiosity won over caution. I needed to know how Robert had reacted, to see if he understood the magnitude of what had just happened. Matthew. Laura's voice was trembling, hovering between panic and disbelief. Something's happened. My dad's company just lost its lead investor. $75 million. Their lawyer just delivered a formal notice of withdrawal. He's completely falling apart. He's locked in his office, screaming on the phone at everyone. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, keeping my voice carefully neutral. My fingers tapped a steady rhythm on the arm of my chair, a beat that matched my heart. The lawyers won't tell him who pulled out, Laura continued, the words coming in a desperate rush. They said it was an anonymous investment group, but now they're claiming a breach of confidentiality terms or something. Matthew, this is terrible. My dad is talking about bankruptcy. He said without this investment, the company has 3 months tops. 3 months until everything falls apart. I stayed quiet, listening to her breathing on the other end of the line, fast and shallow. I could picture her at her sister's house, pacing back and forth, chewing on her thumbnail like she always did when she was nervous. The irony of the situation was so perfect it was almost poetic. Matthew, I know you work in finance. Do you think, could you maybe ask around? See if anyone knows anything about this investment group. Who they are, why they pulled out. Maybe if my dad could just talk to them directly, explain the situation, they might reconsider. The irony was almost too perfect. She was asking me to help find the investor who could save her father, not knowing she was talking to him. She was pleading with the man who held Robert's future in his hands to look for a solution that only I could provide. I'll see what I can do, I said, and even to me my voice sounded distant, as if it belonged to someone else. I'll make some calls, talk to some contacts. But Laura, you have to understand, the investment world is complicated. Anonymous groups exist for a reason. If they decided to pull out, it's usually because they saw something in the numbers they didn't like. But 3 months, Matthew. She was crying now, choked sobs breaking up her words. He's going to lose everything. The company he built, his reputation, everything. And the employees, think of the employees. 23 families are going to be out of a job. I know, and I truly am sorry for them. But that's not my fault, Laura. I know. Just, please try. For me. After I hung up, I stared at the phone for a long time. A part of me, a small and shrinking part, wanted to call her back and tell her the truth. I wanted to hear her reaction when she found out who I really was, but that would spoil the reveal I had so carefully orchestrated. I drafted 2 text messages and scheduled them to be sent the next morning. The first would go to Laura, the second to Robert. They would both arrive at exactly 10 a.m., along with a third message from James Price's office, officially releasing the information about my identity as the withdrawn investor. The message to Laura was simple. You asked me to look into the anonymous investor. Look at the next message. For Robert, I wrote something more direct. Mr. Sterling, the nobody sitting at your dinner table, was the only man who could save your company. Sincerely, Matthew Hayes, CEO of Ventura Capital. I reviewed the messages 3 times before scheduling them, tweaking each word until they were perfect. Simple, direct, devastating. By tomorrow afternoon, everyone would know exactly who they were dealing with. That night, I went through the BioNexus files one more time. Not because I needed to confirm my decision, but because I wanted to fully understand the extent of Robert's incompetence. What I found confirmed everything I suspected about his business acumen, or lack thereof. The company had been hemorrhaging money for 18 months, ever since a failed product launch that Robert had insisted on pushing through, despite warnings from his research team. The internal memos told a clear story. Senior scientists presenting data that showed the product wasn't ready, Robert dismissing their concerns as academic pessimism. The marketing team warning the market wasn't prepared, Robert insisting his gut instincts were right. He had ignored his own scientists, convinced that his business instincts, fueled by decades of arrogance and unearned success, were superior to their technical expertise. The resulting disaster cost BioNexus its partnership with 2 major pharmaceutical companies and nearly $15 million in wasted development costs. But instead of taking responsibility, of looking in the mirror and acknowledging he'd made a catastrophic error, Robert blamed the research team. He fired 3 senior scientists who had a collective 40-plus years of experience. He restructured the R&D department to report directly to him, eliminating any system of checks and balances that might question his future decisions. And then, with his company bleeding cash and his reputation in tatters among serious investors, he started looking for new investors to bail him out, not to fix the fundamental problems, not to rebuild the research culture he had destroyed, just to inject enough money to postpone the inevitable collapse. What made it all worse was that Laura had been one of the scientists who argued against the launch. I found her name on several of the internal memos, her signature on detailed technical reports explaining exactly why the product would fail. She had written a 22-page memo, meticulously documented with trial data, market projections, and risk analysis. Robert had scrawled a single line in response across the top of the document: too conservative. Proceed as planned. When the launch failed exactly as Laura had predicted, when the FDA rejected their approval application, citing the same stability concerns she had raised months earlier, Robert made her life so miserable that she eventually quit. Passive-aggressive comments in meetings, exclusion from key projects, insinuations that she wasn't a team player, that her scientific caution was holding the company back. Laura had never told me the full story. When I asked why she left BioNexus, she gave vague answers about wanting to explore new opportunities, about feeling she'd hit a ceiling at her father's company. She mentioned she'd had some disagreements with her dad over research priorities, but she framed it as a philosophical difference of opinion, not as what it really was: Robert's arrogance steamrolling sound science and, in the process, destroying his own daughter's career. I realized then that Robert hadn't just insulted me at family dinners. He had systematically destroyed anything or anyone that threatened his inflated self-image. His daughter, his team, his company. Everything was expendable at the altar of his ego. And Laura, for some reason I would probably never fully understand, kept protecting him, kept making excuses, kept hoping he would change, that he would somehow become the father she needed him to be instead of the man he actually was. The next morning, the messages went out at exactly 10 a.m. I was in my office, looking out over the city, when my phone confirmed their delivery. 3 messages sent, 3 bombs detonated simultaneously. I pictured Robert in his office, reading the message on his phone, the initial shock giving way to rage, then to panic. I pictured Laura at her sister's house, staring at the screen, trying to process the information, trying to reconcile the husband she thought she knew with the man I truly was. My phone rang 9 minutes later. Robert, as expected. When I answered, he was already screaming, "You son of a bitch! You think this is funny? You think you can destroy my company because I hurt your little feelings? Mr. Sterling, I think you've misunderstood the situation." "I haven't misunderstood anything." He was breathing heavily, each exhale laced with barely contained rage. "Laura told me everything. You're the investor. You're the one who pulled out. You planned this from the start, didn't you? Sat at my table, listened to my opinions, all while you were plotting to stab me in the back. Correct on my identity, incorrect on the planning. In fact, Mr. Sterling, I was genuinely prepared to invest in BioNexus. The documents were ready for my signature, right up until you decided that humiliating your daughter's husband in front of your entire family would be a good idea.